You're watching the Eternal Tournament Series.
Hello and welcome to round 5 here at week 1 of the 4th season of the Eternal Tournament Series. I am Truedawn, joined by my wonderful co-host LocoPojo.
HiThar, and by that I mean it's actually HiThar versus Unearthly in a Rakano Plate versus Big Cambrai matchup. I think we're going to be seeing a bit of a splash here. Unearthly going to be trying to run over the Cambrai deck before it gets out of control with those Mystic Ascendants and the Iron Thorns.
Yep, traditionally this matchup leans a little bit in Cambrai's favor because Cambrai is not so slow that Rakano can really get underneath it, and they have answers to like the Voltron stuff, so it's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle for Unearthly, but it's certainly a matchup that is winnable.
Yeah, we have a fairly low to the ground Big Cambrai, I would say. Like with only 3 Iron Thorns and 3 Harsh Rules, 2 Xenon Obelisks, most of the stuff in this deck is actually at 4 or below. So that means that HiThar might actually have a really decent matchup against the more aggressive Rakano, just getting into the late game stuff a little bit later or a little bit earlier with all of the extra stuff that he's putting in the early game.
Yeah, it still has generally the same amount of creatures: the 4 Scribes, Cambrai Healer, Seraph. These have 1 Scorpion Wasp, 3 Valkyrie. A lot of the creatures are the same. I do like not playing 4 Harsh Rolls in this deck. I think that's a card people play way too much of, especially in a tournament where you have access to a sideboard. It's definitely a lot better to hedge. But yeah, his build is definitely situated in such a way where he should have a lot of game against what Unearthly is presenting.
Yep, and we've seen Unearthly's deck pull through in a previous round, so it should be pretty exciting to see how it does against a slower deck and a little bit.
I think this is actually one of the matchups where Unearthly's current build is actually worse than more traditional builds because he only has the Oni Ronin for 1 drop. His deck isn't very fast, and it's relying heavily upon things like Silverwing Familiar to become very large, and Tinker Overseer. Like flying is a very premier part of his deck, and against Cambrai, they just have Valkyrie, Desert Marshal, Sandstorm Titan, Scorpion Wasp. It's just going to be really hard to leverage those things, but we'll see how he's able to do so as we move here into game 1.
Get enough value out of those quick draws. Premium way to do that. Okay, so we have a setup of Unearthly with plenty of 2 drops available. He's going to be set up pretty well there with the protects for his various cards, and of course Champion of Glory coming out pretty early as a 1/3 with Endurance.
Yeah, it's always unfortunate to have to just run out a champion without protection, but that's going to be pretty okay here. You really wanted to be able to protect the champions because they are very good and they're very vulnerable to silence. So being able to play the Tinker Overseer that turn is a lot better. If you get silenced, you don't really care as much.
Yeah, it's a good way to sort of bait out some early aggression, and those Tinker Overseers, he can play 2 of them here, which makes it a really reasonable 2-drop. This Tinker Overseer is replacing Crown Watch Paladin in Unearthly's decks, basically just giving him a different 2-drop option for pushing across damage that ends up being a cheap flyer that functions very well with Sword of Ikaria.
Yeah, flying does matter a lot. Like, this is going to be able to attack for 2 in a spot where Crown Watch Paladin would have nothing to do, so certainly there's certainly a case to be made for it, and we do see Unearthly elect to play the other Tinker Overseer instead of Silver Familiar, leaving up Protect.
Yep, I think it's a reasonable option to do it this way. He's got the Vanquish for Sandstorm Titan, so he's really only worried about Desert Marshals or some sort of answer to the flyers. And if you see an answer to the flyers, that's something that isn't going to be used on the Silverwing Familiar later. So he's able to establish a pretty decent board pretty early on.
And this is going to be what this matchup boils down to a lot, is whether or not the flyers on the side of Unearthly continue to be able to fly. Whether a Sandstorm Titan can stick or there's Desert Marshals. If the game keeps progressing the way it is, Unearthly is going to be in pretty good shape. But if a Sandstorm Titan sticks or there's multiple Desert Marshals or something, that's where Unearthly is going to run into trouble.
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky here, especially because HiThar has already actually put down quite a bit of tempo. Those Temple Scribes gave him a little bit of health back, and that number is going to be meaningful. The extra 2 health might matter. so too does all of this aggression. The Seraphs, along with the Temple Scribes, along with the Xenon Obelisk. HiThar is actually pushing more damage than Unearthly at
Yeah,
this
he's
point.
currently winning the race. The Vanquish will help alleviate that, taking down the Seraph. He can do that and still leave up the Protect, which is likely what we're going to see. He could even play another Champion of Glory if he's content to leave the Protect down for a turn. But this race is going to be pretty close, and Unearthly is not out of the woods yet.
Yeah, it's not gonna be easy. Like, not only did Xenon Obelisk establish like a really strong opener against those Temple Scribes, but also he has to deal with just a lot of like overall aggression here. So like the main thing is that Unearthly has not been building any Warcries himself. He's just got these Tinker Overseers. He's played a lot of units that are extremely good on stats, but do not build anything extra into his deck. So he's not going to pull any sort of late game closer card. If HiThar gets to his big stuff and can keep it there, then there's going to be some problems.
Yeah, and Unearthly's still drawing to things like Crownwatch Cavalry, Hammer of Might, Deep Forge Plate, all of which on Silver and Familiar are pretty problematic for HiThar when Unearthly has a Vanquish for a potential Sandstorm Titan.
Yep, I'm actually a little surprised that he didn't Combo Healer the Silverwing Familiar just to pop that Aegis off, but there's not much in HiThar's hand that can actually address the Silverwing Familiar, so I can see reasons for basically ignoring it and keeping up the Scorpion Wasp instead.
Yes, certainly. And it also, he wouldn't have really been able to block the champion super well if you didn't use it as his own healer.
Yeah, from here, HiThar has less aggression. He can't really deal with the Champion of Glory, so he needs to consider either playing his Martial Ironthorn or setting up another Seraph and getting a little bit more tempo on the board. He has Harsh Rule, which is a decent answer to some threats, but more likely that is going to just hurt his own board because there's Protect from Unearthly. So there will be 2 units left. He'll trade basically 3 for 3 here.
Yeah, it's card economy is usually going to not be great when you use Harsh Rule in this deck. You're going to usually have creatures. It's just mainly, are your creatures more important than yours? And I think Unearthlies are generally going to be more important than HiThar's.
That Shogun Scepter on the Silverwing Familiar definitely establishes a pretty decent baseline for beatings. HiThar can now have a better Harsh Rule, but he doesn't have one in his hand, so he's going to
leaving down Wasp is a little risky. Like if, for example, he would just die to play. Although he died to play regardless. It's not fair. But Hammer of Might, for example, was something that he didn't need to be weak to. But we will see lethal pushed across here by Unearthly, and we will move into game 2.
Yep. Yeah, that was a really impressive showing from Unearthly, just pushing down a lot of really scary units. This Rakano playtech is actually quite a bit different than the standard Rakano decks that you might expect. It's not very Warcry heavy. There's no swords. There's no Crownwatch Paladin. The swords come in the sideboard if they come in at all. So really what Unearthly's pushing on is just the sheer value of his own cards. And that seemed to have worked out very well for him here with the tiny flyers and the overall just aggressive weapon strategy that he was running.
Unearthly's deck is very Silverwing Familiar centric. It's built largely around making that card good. That's why you see a lot of weapons, protects. Like his deck is a lot slower. It doesn't really have like the double one drop aggressive draws that you might see on other builds of Rakano. It's a little bit slower, but it does have it produces harder to beat threats, and we did see that pay off in that game.
Yeah, and we've seen that like basically they're just really good substitutes for the Silverwing Familiar at every turn. Not only are the aggressive quick draw units pretty nasty when they have weapons on them, they're basically evasive units in and of themselves, but we also have the Tinker Overseer. Basically every unit in Unearthly's deck, or at least all of his early drops, have some sort of evasive ability that makes them much better with the weapons that he's equipping on them.
Yeah, the one problem with a lot of the smaller creatures is that, like, a Shogun Scepter and Crouch Paladin can't attack into a 2/2, for example. So having a lot of your creatures of evasion does make a lot of your weapons better. And we could take a minute to talk about the sideboard here. We saw Unearthly sideboarding for a bit, and HiThar's still doing it. HiThar's options include stuff like Healer's Cloak, Steward Prophecies, and Obelisk, Reality Warden, Awakened Student, Dawnwalker. Currently, he has a Dawnwalker in, which is a little interesting to me. Steward of Prophecy is pretty good. If you ever tag a Silver Familiar, that's good. But, like, that doesn't really work on curve normally, but if you're able to snag one, that's great. And
Yeah,
Reality War is just a giant idiot.
Yeah, having a lot of early units is generally the best way to sort of deal with most Rakano threats, but this is a different type of animal, so it's hard to say if he's going to sideboard correctly against it. We see one of the Find the Ways cut, which is a really interesting cut there. Dealing with your power is always a little bit scary. The Mystic Ascendants are going down to 2, which I think is probably right, although it will lead to some problems in the late game with just inevitability if he can't keep the Seraph or the Mystic Ascendant on the board against the Vanquishes and whatever else Unearthly has in his deck.
If he's bringing the Reality Wardens, he shouldn't, and like stuff like that in Sandstorm Tide, he shouldn't have a huge problem turning the corner. But yeah, as we've talked about earlier in previous sideboarding games, there's always a balance when you're sideboarding as the big Combre deck where you don't want to take out all of your top end because then you can't turn the corner if you stabilize.
We're matching mid-ranges here, and it's possible that the Combre mid-range is going to be a little bit less efficient than the Rakano mid-range, which is already built to be a mid-range deck. So we will see how well that functions, and we're going to be going into Game 2 of Unearthly versus HiThar.
Yep, and that sure is a hand there from Earthly. I'm sure that's going back, and it does. Dragon's not that good.
Yeah.
Did you see Unearthly brought in the Jack?
Oh yeah, the Jack, always a grand card, especially if you're in a mid-range matchup. Like I really like Jack. I think he's a very solid drop and doesn't see enough play at all. So it's good to see him in this deck, pushing through against those big Combre archetypes, which is one of the places he really shines.
That was actually an interesting turn from Unearthly, even though it's just turn 2. He could have played the Monument, which prevents him from playing a 2-drop, allows him to play a 3-drop next turn. What he elected to do was play the 2-drop, and now he has no play this turn. So,
yeah, it gives you a chance at drawing an extra power and being able to play your 3-drops and keep the Monument for a bit, which you have so many different plays at 3 that it's possible that that's the better way to do it. Overall, it does certainly cause him to suffer a little bit in tempo.
yeah, but Unearthly's just on the I'm going to try and fly above your head plan. He has to take care of this Titan. Another Titan is a problem. Doesn't Marshal. He's now like out of interaction, but Xenonobolus is something Unearthly is probably pretty happy to see.
He banks a little less damage as a result. He gets a better top deck, which may end up being very good, especially in the case of a Harsh Rule. But we'll see. It looks like Unearthly is just pushing an insane amount of damage. That Soulfire Drake here is another 5. And then without a Desert Marshal, this gets...
And a cool thing about Unearthly's deck construction is that in his deck, Soulfire Drake's trigger is actually exceptional because he has such a high density of flyers. So if something already is flying, it has to get charged from Soulfire Drake's trigger. So he's just going to be drawing a bunch of flying charge units off the top.
Yep, and it's a very, very strong matchup for him. Jack the Bounty Hunter gets him a silence and a stun. He could trade here and just get the charge units, but it's even better to just deal that damage. And now HiThar is vulnerable to Torch. This may be a very short 2-0.
Yep, that was just kind of a savaging by Unearthly there, seeing his deck going at full capacity. Sideboard plan worked out. Jack was relevant there. Just Jack being just a way to interact with your opponent's blockers in a deck where you're so reliant on getting your flyers through. Like the fact that it's just a giant Valkyrie Enforcer essentially is a really important card. And we saw it just be able to force through the last bit of damage there in a spot where if he didn't have that, he actually would have had to trade the Soulfire Drake, play something else, and then that creature might be able to get through the giant creatures that HiThar was presenting on the following turn. So Jack actually did a lot more work than it seemed, even though like it kind of looked like Unearthly would have won anyway, but Jack was important.
Yeah, I mean, Unearthly had a depleted power that threw a slight wrench into his overall turn, but he played a great 2-drop, a great 3-drop, a great 4-drop, a great 5-drop, and a great 6-drop, and all of that contributed to just the snowballing over HiThar. I think just overall, like that was just a perfect curve for him. It went very, very well against the mid-range deck, and it ended up silencing that Titan, pushing just so much damage that a Harsh Rule was certainly not nearly enough to come back.
Yeah, and I actually like how Unearthly's deck looks post-sideboard, just slowing down a bit, having all the flyers, Soulfire Drake, Jack, all that stuff just worked very well together. Having all the silences for Sandstorm Titans or potential other flyers that could block your flyers, just ruling the air is a really good place to be in a lot of combat-based matchups.
I'm not even sure that I would call this a plate deck at this point. It's actually very, very consistently like a Flyers deck, or like it has it has sort of a different type of element to it. I think this is a really actually fairly unique has brought to the table. It's a little bit different from his normal Rakano, so take note. It's a cool new list.
Yeah, there's stuff I've played around with like this before. Like I've gone like too deep. Unearthly's done a good job of like splitting it up. He has different game plans. Basically, with his side, he has a lot of choices and where he wants to go. He's not like all in on the flyer stuff. He still has plate. He still has champion, all that. So it's just a really good. It's a complete 90 cards, which is what you really want. You're going to need to win a tournament. Like you can't just build your 75 and then like throw in random sideboard cards. The best decks in any game where sideboarding is involved are the ones that have a complete cohesive 90 cards.
Yep. Yeah, and it's a very cohesive indeed. I'm surprised to see that he's running 4 ruins in his sideboard. I'm really like that's impressive. That's a card that people often tend to ignore, even though it is a very, very powerful attachment destruction option. Yeah. But 4 of them in the side means that he's expecting some serious threats from the relics these games. So I'm curious to see how many times he ends up sideboarding those in the course of his tournament matches.
And we do have a backup match, as we are going to see Toth and Surles. Surles currently leads 1-0. Surles is on Combre Aggro, Toth on Akaria Gold, of course. And we are in a pretty late in the game. This is a bit of a board stall, though it looks like with that turn, Toth is starting to pull ahead.
Yeah, Surles really can't activate the Seraph because the Seraph is already silenced, so Toth is in a very powerful position. It's pretty hard to come back from this. If Surles can pick up Seraph soon, like it'd have to be basically this turn. So I think he may be out of options. He needs to pick up a Harsh Rule and not get stand together.
Yeah, Toth's Jack makes these attacks really good. He already had pretty decent attacks, and they got even better. He could also just like a jam with the Flyers, play Seraph. He could be more conservative if he wants to do that. A lot of options available to Toth here.
Yeah, that option definitely does get him a little bit more protection against the Harsh Rule, which is probably the only card that's going to knock him out of this game at this point. So I would probably opt for the Seraph here and see if you can actually push like a little bit more value. But if you're going to go straight for the throat, that's not a bad option either. This might actually be lethal.
Let's see, the 6 and the 5 get blocked, and it's 7, 11, 15, 17, 18. It is too short, if my math is right.
Yeah, that looks right. 12 plus 6 plus 8. So yeah, you've got wait, no, that's exactly lethal. Hang on a sec. Maybe I'm incorrect about this. 12 plus 6 plus 8. Which is to say an exact 20. Okay, so yeah, it looks like that is the game. So Jack is in fact the correct one. For new players, the basic way that you tend to do these like combat math type things is you take and then you just subtract your largest units from that value, and then from that you can get the basic idea of how much damage there is, and that turned out to be exact lethal, so worked out pretty well.
Yep, and we will be moving to game 3. Toth has a chance to battle all the way back to win the round. Surles trying to defend his previous lead. We can take a quick look at the sideboards both people for them. We've seen Toth's earlier. Surles we haven't seen yet, so we can go over his. He has 5 towers in the sideboard: Protect, Copperhall Bailiff, Decay, Vodkin Staff, Ancient Lore, and Copperhall Elite. This is an interesting sideboard. A lot of like not really specific answers, a lot of transformative stuff, like things you would bring in if you want to change the pace of your deck, like if you want to be more aggressive, 5 towers, more threat types with Copperhall Elites, stuff like that. So in this matchup, I would expect Surles wants to be the beatdown, so he'd probably be more aggressive. 5 towers seems reasonable, stuff like that. But that may not necessarily be the case. He's able to implement several game plans.
Yeah, it should be a matchup of whether or not we can get these Iron Thorns and Mystic Ascendants going. We can get the sort of late game action from Toth with Akaria and Iron Thorn and Mystic Ascendant. That's really the place where Toth's deck's going to shine. But Surles has some pretty good options.
Yeah, Surles' deck is a lot lower to the ground. It curves, like the top of the curve is Reality War, and there's no Iron Thorns and no Mystic Ascendants, no stuff like that. So he really wants to capitalize on the fact.
Not giving Toth the option of playing the Cambrai, the Awakened Student early, but does give him the choice of playing it next turn for 2 and then giving it a slight buff, which could be pretty good if Surles doesn't have enough aggressive stuff. Valkyrie Enforcer will be a decent answer, though.
Yeah, I think that it's just going to be about whether Surles can apply some pressure. Toth, with this Awakened Student, is going to actually like kind of flip the script here. Now he's the one who's ahead on board. He has this Awakened Student threatening to grow. If he draws a power, it becomes a 4/4, and he can play Sandstorm Titan. So he's going to get ahead on board pretty quickly, and it's unclear how equipped Surles' deck is to play from behind.
Yeah, and if you're going to be trying to slow down the more aggressive decks, Awakened Student's definitely one of the better cards to do it. It's not necessarily your most awesome like early play, like it's not a super defensive card, but it still gives you extra 2-drops in a situation where big Cambrai often just tends to skip them. So I think overall that's giving Toth a 3/3 to block with, which certainly prevents Surles from having a lot of stuff active.
We do see the Fire Sour protect the Valkyrie Force from the Torch there. Toth does draw power, however, it comes to play depleted, so he cannot follow up with the Sandstorm Titan. He could play Valkyrie Enforcer if he wants to do that. He could torch the Valkyrie Enforcer, he could play nothing. Several options available to Toth here this turn.
Torching the Valkyrie Enforcer does seem like a pretty good idea here with no Finest Hour open. He does attack with the Awakened Student, which a bit cheeky, I would say, since he's generally trying to sort of get into the late game stall, but it works out just fine. He'll get to torch the Valkyrie Enforcer if he wants to, or he can just silence it.
Looks like he's content to silence it. That attack was trying to bait a double block, or it's like I'm actually not sure what that was actually doing, because it wouldn't be a double block. Just like trade, and then he has to torch post combat or during combat. So yeah, a little cheeky.
So he does get the now that torch is no longer an option. I think I don't know if I agree with the Valkyrie Enforcer play in general. Now Toth is actually on the back foot. He's holding off against this 4/4 Valkyrie Enforcer. He's got Sandstorm Titan and some other options, but he has to deal with cards like Vanquish. He has to deal with the fact that Surles is just very actively trying to kill him, and he has just kind of the late game that he really, really wants to get to. So I don't know. I feel like he's playing very aggressive here.
Yeah, it's one of the classic ways to lose a game you would otherwise be situated to win is by misassessing your role, by trying to be the beatdown when you're not, by trying to be on defense when you should be attacking. Assessing that is one of the most important parts.
It's
the Awakened Student was silenced, by the way. That's why. It's like, why didn't he pump it? It's because it was silenced.
So at this point, we have at this point, Toth is no longer the aggressor, and Surles is the one who's sort of, Toth's aggression has actually sort of paid off. Surles is actually in a position where he needs to be a little bit more defensive, but Toth is the one who's sitting on the aggressive stuff. He has he's got the Reality Wardens. I think everything here just sort of lends itself to the more aggressive style.
Yeah, Scorpion Wasp was a little bit awkward in that capacity because it's good at blocking. Like, it forces you to leave up mana, not attack. So now we're getting to a bit of a board stall, which you'd figure favors Toth, although, as you said, the texture of his hand is atypical, considering what his deck usually presents.
Yeah, that Deforged plate just really, that's the big question of like who is actually the aggro here. Toth is definitely going to continue to push, and it doesn't look like Surles has great answers to the Deforged plate in hand. So looks like it might be an easier pickup for Toth than you'd expect.
Surles says, like, he has these Cambrai healers, which look odd given how proactive his deck is, but like actually pumping the toughness of an Awakened Student early is really good. But in this situation, it's like they're not helping him advance his game plan. They're like doing a pretty good job of blocking, but Surles doesn't want to be blocking. Surles wants to somehow manifest profitable attacks because he's not going to win this late game. He doesn't have Mystic Ascendance. He doesn't have Ikaria. He doesn't have Great Parliament.
Yeah, if he's going to win the late game, it's going to be off the back of cards like Marison's Disciple and just getting his Xenon Obelisk up to 8. But that type of value is only going to last for so long, and it's still not very good against cards like Reality Warden and Deep Forge Plate. So he's got a lot of meat to overcome. There's a huge wall in front of him.
And we're probably going to get to a point where like Toth has to use this Deforged Plate to trade for 2 creatures. Like right now, if he puts it on the Reality Warden, it's actually not big enough, so we likely won't see the Deforged Plate come down yet. So Toth is kind of in a position where he doesn't have proper attacks, but I think Toth is okay with that because again, he has a lot of like big top end cards that Surles does not have access to. So the longer the game goes, the more it likely favors Toth.
Yeah, he could always attack with one of these units to kind of try and clear out the board a little bit more. If he can get rid of just a little bit off this board, then basically all of his other stuff has more of a chance to get through. They're inadequate trades, but Toth does appear to be the beatdown, so it's possible that he wants to do that.
And Toth, knowing deck lists, Surles does not have Harsh Rule in his deck. He's much too proactive for that, so Toth can freely like extend out in the board. There's no downside for doing so.
And if he doesn't end up doing that, Surles is not sitting on a lot that's really helpful here. And Toth does have the late game with the Seraphs, the Ascendants, and the Martial Ironthorns. So there's not really a huge downside to playing defensively here. He's got Surles stalled out well enough, and he's going to be playing some pretty useful cards for later.
Yeah, the Seraph is a big draw. It does give him inevitability. He is 2 powers short of being able to ultimate it, so he likely won't play it this turn. There's not like a lot of reason to extend it to silence prematurely when you don't need to, but it's probably going to get silenced either way if they do have it, even if you play it on 7. So
yeah,
we do see him like to play it.
He does play it out. He's got this Scorpion Wasp here for silences on the Sandstorm Titans, so that's not really an out for Surles. I think that a matter of whether or not Surles can find some way of pushing through this board. I'm not sure if there is one.
I think that his best shot of pushing through this board is like multiple Xenon Obelisks. Like that's the only thing I could think of. Outside of that, this deck is really not equipped to come back from behind. It doesn't have any tools to do that.
Well, he's gone for the beatdown play. He did in fact silence the Sandstorm Titan instead of the Seraph, which means that really, really hard to draw himself into power and get that Seraph up. But at the same time, Surles is already at 8 power and swinging across with a 5/5 every turn, which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, we're likely going to see Toth play this Parliament and then look to Deepforge play it so he's a blocker, because this 5/5 flyer is not a joke. It represents a 5-turn clock, and if any like 1 damage comes to augment it, it is a 4 damage clock, or 4-turn clock rather. Sorry.
Yep,
so he wants to try and block
obelisk. Get like some wasps or something. I think there's a lot of different options. Surles has to get a Vanquish or something along those lines for the Deepforge Plate Owl, but by and large, it's not looking like it's a bad plan to continue to attack with this Valkyrie Enforcer.
Not only does the Deforged Plate Owl block, it also attacks. So he gets to like start giving the beatdowns.
Yep. 9 damage a turn, which is enough that Toth may seriously want to consider it.
I mean, I don't see a reason to not do it. I mean, yeah, if they have Vanquish, that's awful, but you're still dying to this 5/5. What else is Deforged Plate doing? It's not helping you attack on the ground. I think you go for it. If they have it, unfortunate. But if they don't, you just run roughshod over the game with this 9/9 flyer.
Yeah, and of course, like if they don't have it, then you still have Seraph as a potential 8-drop. Didn't get your Seraph silence. The Sandstorm Titans are what you went for. From here, Surles is a lot of good options. Oh, another 9 damage and a Mystic Ascendant. That's pretty rough. Yeah. Surles was in a lot of trouble now.
Yeah, Surles is flooded out a bit. His deck is like reasonably well equipped to deal with Flood. He has the backside of Xenon Obelisk. He has Seraph, but it's not a lot. Like he can only flood so much. So like 9th, 10th, 11th power, not something he's interested in seeing.
Yeah, if he gets a Vanquish here, he's still got that same chance as before of slowly flying over Toth, but Toth is pushing a lot of damage, and with the Mystic Ascendant, he can now push lethal with just the units on the ground. He doesn't actually have to use Mystic Ascendant for value here. It's a big enough unit that it can actually make a really scary deck happen with Surles.
Yeah, but currently 4 blockers to 6 attackers. Any combination of 2 is lethal. Although the Desert Marshal that Surles just draws does break that up.
Yeah, that looks like game. Toth can now attack with everything.
Well, that's the Icaria. However,
Top deck Dakaria, all of the late game stuff coming out. That's a wrap there.
yeah, that's it. This does look to be lethal, and even if it wasn't, these are super profitable attacks. So
It does actually get the owl out of the way, push the 5 damage, and allow him a couple of better blocks, but Surles just doesn't have enough material on the ground.
yep, and Toth will take the game 2-1, continue to move on, continue to find success with his Akari Gold deck in the Eternal Tournament series. It's become a mainstay of the series, regularly getting top 8s with that deck. And I don't think he's in yet, but he's in a good shape to do so as we move into the penultimate round shortly. Or the ultimate round.
Will we be seeing Toth in the quarterfinals? That's an interesting question, and one that we will answer soon. Tune in for round 6 soon, guys. Forward to seeing you there.
Yep, we'll be back shortly for round 6. See you then.